In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where nothing ever seems amiss, a trembling informant slips a sealed envelope into Miss Marple's knitting basket and vanishes before she can utter a word. Inside lies a cryptic warning, a name hastily crossed out, and a mystery the village pretends not to see. Why is everyone suddenly afraid to speak? What secret is worth silencing? And who is watching Miss Marple from behind the lace curtains? As whispers grow into danger, the elderly detective must unravel the truth hidden in everyday moments before the village's quiet charm turns fatally deceptive. Chapter 1. A Whisper in St. Mary Mead Morning. Sunlight filtered gently through the neat curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting a soft glow over the pastel wallpaper and the shelves lined with carefully dusted porcelain figurines. It was a typical day in St. Mary Mead, the kind of quiet, well-mannered morning in which nothing very dramatic ought to occur, unless, of course, one looked closely enough. Miss Marple always did. She sat by her favorite window, knitting needles clicking in a calm, practiced rhythm, her sharp blue eyes drifting occasionally to the lane outside. The village had a rhythm of its own, one she understood with the intuitive grace of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human nature in its purest form. Small-town life. Across the lane, Mrs. Weatherby was hanging washing, 3 shirts in descending size, which Miss Marple noted with a faint smile. The eldest Weatherby boy had returned from London for a short visit, and judging by the shirts, he had put on a little weight. The smallest observations often revealed the largest stories, something many overlooked but which Miss Marple found endlessly fascinating. Yet even she was unprepared for the event that would soon disturb the quiet predictability of her day. Shortly after 10, as the air warmed and the distant church bells completed their gentle tolling, a hurried tapping sounded at her garden gate. It was not the hesitant knock of a polite caller nor the firm rap of the postman. This was quick, anxious, almost desperate. Miss Marple paused mid-stitch, head tilting slightly as she listened. Her first instinct was curiosity, her second, concern. People did not knock like that in St. Mary Mead unless something weighed heavily on their conscience. She rose with a soft rustle of skirts and made her way to the door, opening it just in time to see a figure, a small, slim woman in a faded blue coat, standing rigidly on the path. Her face was pale, her eyes darting about as though she feared being followed. For a moment the woman said nothing. She merely clutched her handbag tight against her chest, breathing in short, trembling bursts. "Yes, my dear?" Miss Marple asked kindly, though her eyes were already noting details: mud-stained hem, a roughly stitched rip in the sleeve, and gloves that did not match. A woman in distress often forgot her appearance, but this one seemed to have come by her dishevelment through something more immediate than worry, something like flight. The woman swallowed. "Miss Marple?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am indeed." The stranger looked around once more, then leaned forward and slipped a small sealed envelope into Miss Marple's knitting basket, which hung from the crook of her arm. "Please, read this only when you're alone, and don't tell anyone I was here." Miss Marple blinked in surprise. "My dear, perhaps you'd like to come in and sit down. You look quite—" "No!" The word came out abruptly, strained by fear. I cannot stay. They'll notice. Someone always notices." Miss Marple opened her mouth gently. "Who, my dear?" But the woman was already stepping back, shaking her head. "Just be careful, and trust no one." With that, she turned sharply and hurried down the lane, her shoes clattering unevenly on the cobblestones. Miss Marple watched as the woman disappeared around the bend, almost colliding with Mr. Pollard's bicycle. The man shouted a complaint, but she did not stop. She vanished into the hedgerows as though the shadows themselves had swallowed her up. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, closing her garden gate behind her as she went back inside. An envelope in her knitting basket was certainly peculiar, but peculiarities were not rare in St. Mary Mead, only rarely so dramatic. She settled into her chair once again and examined the envelope. It was unmarked, sealed with a hasty smear of wax rather than a proper stamp or address. No handwriting, no name. The paper was creased, as though it had been handled nervously, or hidden somewhere for quite some time. Before opening it, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to think. She knew nearly everyone in St. Mary Mead, and while the woman's face was vaguely familiar, she could not place her immediately. There was something about the coat, a blue coat worn by someone working just outside the village, perhaps? Or a visitor? Miss Marple prided herself on remembering clothing, as people often changed their expressions but rarely their favorite garments. She drew a small silver letter opener from her writing desk, slit the envelope carefully, and removed a single folded sheet of paper. Inside was a message written in hurried, uneven letters. Someone in St. Mary Mead is not who they appear to be. I cannot say more, not safely. I have seen something I should not have. Please help before it's too late. Beneath the message was a name that had been scribbled out so thoroughly that only the first initial remained visible. A. Miss Marple read the message twice. The first time she felt a prickle of intrigue. The second, a deeper, more unsettling concern. It was one thing for strangers to bring her small inquiries or domestic puzzles. Lost brooches, minor disputes, the occasional suspicion of petty theft. But this was fear. Not imagined fear, nor the gossip-fueled fear of misinterpreted events, but genuine terror. She folded the letter and placed it gently on her lap, staring out the window as her mind began to spin its delicate, precise threads. Someone in St. Mary Mead was not who they appeared to be. A curious accusation, as the village was filled with people who were very precisely who they appeared. Or at least, so most would believe. Miss Marple had long learned that even the most respectable appearances could hide the oddest or darkest secrets. She had seen it in her travels, her acquaintances, and most of all in the village she knew so well. The danger, of course, lay in determining what counted as not who they appear to be, because people were rarely one-dimensional. Secrets, after all, were commonplace, small, personal, and often harmless. But a secret that drove a woman to flee in daylight? That was something else entirely. Her ruminations were interrupted by the arrival of her dear friend, Mrs. Hartnell, who burst through the front gate with all the bustle of a woman who carried her opinions the way a soldier carried weapons, ready at a moment's notice. Miss Marple tucked the letter discreetly under her knitting as Mrs. Hartnell rapped twice and entered without waiting for permission. "Jane, have you heard? Mrs. Atkins claims someone's been prowling about her chicken coop at night. Says the hens were unsettled all morning." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Good morning, Lavinia. Do come sit. Shall I put the kettle on?" "Oh no, I haven't time for tea. I'm off to the churchyard committee meeting. But I simply had to tell you before anyone else. Honestly, what is the world coming to? Chickens being disturbed in broad daylight, or nearly so. It's practically criminal." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though her thoughts drifted. A prowler, a frightened woman, a cryptic letter. St. Mary Mead was no stranger to the occasional odd occurrence, but rarely did several happen in such quick succession. Mrs. Hartnell prattled on about Mrs. Atkins's poor hens until a distant bell reminded her she was late. After flustering herself into a flurry of apologies and half-formed farewells, she hurried out the door again, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender water and indignation. When the house fell silent again, Miss Marple retrieved the letter from beneath her knitting. She considered taking it to the vicar or even Inspector Cribbins in the next village, but caution held her back. The letter itself recommended secrecy. And more importantly, Miss Marple's instinct echoed the same warning. If the writer believed she was in danger, involving the wrong person might worsen her situation. Instead, Miss Marple decided she must first determine who the woman was. Her mind wandered through the possible faces. A beginning initial. Anne, Alice, Agnes. The latter tugged at her memory. Agnes Powell, a young woman who worked as a helper at the manor house, once or twice a week. Perhaps it had been she. Agnes was shy, prone to nerves, and had a blue coat very much like the one worn by the mysterious visitor. But why would Agnes have sought Miss Marple out? And more importantly, what had she seen? The doorbell chimed again. Miss Marple almost expected another excitable villager, but this time it was the postman, cheerful and oblivious. He handed her 2 letters and tipped his cap before moving on. Neither letter was remotely connected to the earlier mystery, though one did contain a gardening catalog she had been hoping for. She set them aside and returned her attention to the window. Outside, the village had resumed its ordinary calm. Children ran down the lane chasing a battered hoop. A dog barked in the distance. The Reverend Clement passed by on his bicycle, humming a hymn that Miss Marple recognized instantly. All appeared peaceful. Yet she could not shake the feeling that somewhere, hidden within this quiet, someone was terribly afraid. Another hour passed in thoughtful silence. Miss Marple sat with her knitting half finished, though she had not added more than a row. Her attention remained fixed on possibilities. Finally she rose, slipped the letter into her pocket, and donned her hat and coat. If she were to find answers, she must start where the clues pointed, the lane in which the woman had vanished. The morning had shifted into early afternoon when Miss Marple stepped outside. The warmth of the sun was pleasant on her shoulders as she strolled down the lane, nodding politely to neighbors she passed. She made her way to the bend where Mr. Pollard had nearly collided with the stranger. The hedgerow here was thick, overgrown in places, a convenient place to disappear from sight. She bent slightly, examining the ground. Not much escaped Miss Marple's trained eyes. Faint footprints in the softer soil, a torn thread caught on a branch and a broken twig at knee level, all indicating someone had passed hurriedly through. The footprints were smaller than average, confirming her suspicion that it was indeed the same woman. As she traced the marks further along the path, Miss Marple became aware of a presence behind her. She turned and found herself facing Major Motherby, a retired military man with a voice as loud as his opinions. He looked surprised to see her there. "Miss Marple, out for a stroll?" he boomed. "Just stretching my legs, Major, and enjoying the sunshine." He glanced at the hedgerow. "Lot of commotion this morning. Almost knocked over some woman who came running like her skirt was on fire. Looked familiar, though I can't place her." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Did she say anything?" "Not to me. Barely acknowledged I was there, in a shocking hurry, had no business running like that, dangerous on these narrow lanes." Miss Marple thanked him and continued on her walk, though her mind now buzzed with certainty. The woman had indeed been fleeing, and from something more substantial than mere nerves. When Miss Marple returned home, she made herself a pot of tea and sat at her table with renewed focus. She examined the letter again, studying the pressure of the pen strokes, the slight trembling in the lower lines. The writer had been in a hurry, and scared, terrified even, and the scratched-out name hinted at someone trying desperately to protect herself, or perhaps protect Miss Marple from knowing too much too soon. Whatever the case, Miss Marple resolved to do what she always did. Observe quietly, ask gently, and let the truth reveal itself through human nature's inevitable slip-ups. For as she well knew, people always revealed more than they intended, not through their words, but through their actions. She glanced at the window once more. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone was not who they appeared to be. Someone was hiding a secret worth frightening a young woman into seeking help from an elderly village spinster. And Miss Marple, her expression soft yet determined, reached for her teacup, knowing full well that no secret could remain hidden for long, not under her watchful eye. Chapter 2. Tea, Scones, and Suspicions. The next morning dawned crisp and clear with a faint golden hue that made the rooftops of St. Mary Mead appear almost picturesque enough for a postcard. Miss Marple, however, had too much on her mind to admire the scenery for long. She sat at her small wooden breakfast table, a teapot gently steaming beside her. The mysterious letter unfolded once more between her delicate fingers. She read it again, slowly, thoughtfully, savoring each word as one might study the brushstrokes of a curious painting. The message was sparse, the handwriting anxious, and the scratched-out name all the more intriguing. It was, she felt, a cry for help concealed within a desperate whisper. Yet life in St. Mary Mead marched on as though nothing unusual had happened. Somewhere outside her window she heard the unmistakable prattle of Mrs. Larchmont greeting the milkman with what she considered a gracious tone that was, to Miss Marple's ear, more commanding than friendly. Church bells chimed faintly in the distance, signaling the hour, and on a nearby branch a small sparrow hopped and chirped, blissfully unconcerned with human troubles. All was familiar and comforting, except, of course, for the nagging uncertainty that had settled in Miss Marple's mind like an unwelcome houseguest. She finished her tea, folded the letter carefully, and placed it into a small envelope she kept for discreet matters. She then donned her hat, pulled on her gloves, and set out toward the center of the village. If she were to learn anything more, she would have to begin with people. And in St. Mary Mead, people were best observed in their natural habitats: the shops, the post office, and most importantly, the tea room. Miss Marple made her way down the lane at a comfortable pace, pausing occasionally to admire a neat flower bed or nod politely to a passing acquaintance. She found herself wondering who among the villagers might be not who they appear to be, as the letter claimed. It was difficult to imagine such duplicity among familiar faces. Mrs. Weatherby, for instance, was as predictable as the changing of the seasons, and the Reverend Clement, though occasionally absent-minded, was hardly the type to harbor secret identities. And yet, people were rarely as simple as they appeared. Even the most charming gardens often concealed tangled roots beneath the soil. When she reached the village high street, the familiar aroma of baked bread and jam drifted toward her from Mrs. Oxley's tea room. This small, cozy establishment was the heart of village chatter, a place where gossip brewed more freely than tea. Inside, several villagers sat at small round tables, each adorned with fresh-cut flowers. Miss Marple entered quietly, her manner as gentle as always, though her eyes missed nothing. Mrs. Oxley, a stout, rosy-cheeked woman with a fondness for floral aprons, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Lovely day, isn't it? Do take a seat. I've just taken a fresh batch of scones out of the oven. How delightful, dear. A pot of Earl Grey and one scone, if you please." Miss Marple chose a table near the window where she could observe both the street outside and the tea room within. She settled into her chair, placing her knitting bag neatly beside her, though her mind was far from thoughts of knitting. As she waited, she noticed Mrs. Hartnell seated at the table nearest the counter, speaking in hushed but excited tones to Miss Pierce, a timid schoolteacher known for her tendency to nod vigorously whenever she agreed with someone, which in Mrs. Hartnell's presence was often. Miss Marple could hear snippets of their conversation drifting across the room. "Ran right past me, nearly knocked over my flower basket," Mrs. Hartnell declared, waving her arms with dramatic flair. "Honestly, what woman runs through the village like that?" "Highly improper." Miss Pierce nodded so rapidly that her hairpins trembled. Miss Marple pretended not to listen, though she was quite aware that the conversation pertained to the same mysterious woman who had visited her. She kept her expression serene as Mrs. Oxley arrived with her tea and scone, placing them gently before her. "There you are, dear. Mind you, it's been quite the morning already." Mrs. Larchmont's spaniel escaped again, ran straight into Mr. Wheeler's vegetable stall. Carrots everywhere. And then there was talk of a strange woman dashing about the village, though no one seems to know who she was. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her smile thoughtful. "Oh dear, how very exciting for such an early hour." Mrs. Oxley laughed. "Indeed, let's hope the excitement ends there. I've no patience for trouble." "No one does," Miss Marple replied gently. As Mrs. Oxley bustled away, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to a corner table. Sitting alone was a young maid from the manor house, Lucy Parker. She was a slender girl with bright eyes but an anxious manner, as though she were always waiting for someone to call her name. She stirred her tea absent-mindedly, gaze lowered, a crease of worry between her brows. Miss Marple recalled that she had seen Lucy once or twice with Agnes Powell, the young woman she suspected might be the frightened visitor. The two were said to be friends, though Miss Marple knew little more than idle whispers. Quietly, Miss Marple rose and approached the girl with a warm smile. "Good morning, Lucy. May I join you for a moment?" Lucy startled slightly but nodded. "Oh, of course, Miss Marple." Miss Marple took the seat across from her, setting her teacup down with gentle precision. "You seem troubled, my dear. Is everything all right at the manor house?" Lucy fidgeted with her spoon. "Oh yes, everything is quite normal. Just tired, I suppose." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Quite understandable. Though do forgive an old woman's curiosity, I couldn't help noticing you looked rather preoccupied." Lucy hesitated, her eyes darting briefly toward the door before returning to Miss Marple. "It's nothing really, just someone I was expecting didn't meet me this morning, that's all." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "A friend?" "Yes." Lucy hesitated again, then whispered, "Agnes. She and I usually walk to work together, but she didn't meet me today." Her lower lip trembled slightly. "She didn't knock on my window like she usually does. I waited, but she never came." Miss Marple's heart sank very slightly. "Did you go to her lodgings to check on her?" "No, I couldn't. I was late already. And Mrs. Channing, the housekeeper, she's terribly strict." Miss Marple reached across the table, patting the girl's hand gently. "I understand, my dear. Perhaps she simply overslept or fell ill. Young women do occasionally neglect their alarms." Lucy nodded, but worry lingered in her eyes. "Agnes would have sent word. She always does. She's very dependable." Miss Marple studied the girl quietly, her mind piecing together possibilities. Agnes Powell, a missing morning routine, a frightened visit, a cryptic letter, someone watching her. "Lucy," Miss Marple said softly, "has Agnes been troubled by anything lately? Anything unusual?" Lucy lowered her voice, leaning forward. "She has seemed different these last few days, nervous, distracted. I asked her about it yesterday, but she brushed me off, said she'd tell me everything soon." Lucy swallowed. "That's why I thought she'd meet me today." Miss Marple felt a chill, not from fear, but from the unsettling confirmation that her instincts were correct. Something had frightened Agnes, and now she was missing. Before Miss Marple could ask more, the tea-room door chimed. A tall, stern-looking man in a dark brown coat stepped in, his eyes scanning the room with military sharpness. It was Mr. Basil Waring, the new steward at the manor house. Miss Marple observed him discreetly. He was not known to socialize in the village, nor did he often appear without purpose. When his gaze landed on Lucy, her posture stiffened immediately. "Ah," he said in a clipped tone, approaching the table. "There you are, Lucy. I wondered where you'd run off to." Lucy jumped to her feet. I'm sorry, sir. I was just having tea," he finished coolly. "Mrs. Channing is expecting you. The silver cabinet needs polishing." "Yes, sir." Mr. Waring then turned his attention to Miss Marple, offering a stiff nod. "Good morning." She returned his nod pleasantly. "Good morning, Mr. Waring. Such a lovely day." "Is it?" he replied dryly, then turned to usher Lucy out. But before she left, Lucy cast Miss Marple a fleeting, grateful glance. After they were gone, Miss Marple sat quietly, her mind weaving patterns like her knitting needles might. Something about Mr. Waring's demeanor troubled her. Not overtly, but subtly. He was new, private, and notoriously watchful. Some said he was efficient, others whispered that he was strict to the point of cruelty. Whatever the truth, he was certainly someone worth observing. Miss Marple finished her tea thoughtfully before leaving the tea room. Outside, she paused in the gentle breeze, her eyes settling on the distant lanes that wound their way toward the manor. If Agnes had indeed tried to seek her out, and if she was now missing, then the situation was more serious than she feared. As she made her way down the street, she encountered Mr. Pollard adjusting his bicycle. He greeted her with a polite nod. "Terrible business yesterday," he said cheerfully. "Nearly ran into that girl. Doesn't the village attract the oddest sort these days?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Mr. Pollard, St. Mary Mead has always attracted the oddest sort. We simply notice it more now." Mr. Pollard laughed. "Perhaps so." Miss Marple walked on, but her mind was no longer focused on the sights of the village. She thought instead of Agnes Powell, of a hurried knock on her door, of a letter scribbled in fear, of a missing friend, and of a village where everyone thought they knew everyone, when clearly someone was very wrong. When she reached her cottage again, she sat in her favorite chair. The letter spread out once more before her. The words seemed to pulse with urgency. Someone in St. Mary Mead is not who they appear to be. Miss Marple had seen many mysteries in her life, but this one carried a quiet danger that concerned her deeply. And yet she felt a familiar stirring, a sense that her mind had been waiting for something to awaken it from the peaceful routine of village life. Trouble was brewing in St. Mary Mead, and it had chosen the most unlikely messenger. A frightened young woman in a blue coat whose absence now weighed heavily on Miss Marple's thoughts. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through her window, Miss Marple folded the letter one final time with a look of calm determination. She had work to do. Chapter 3. The Garden Gate Gossip. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead hummed quietly with speculation, though nothing was spoken directly. Miss Marple could sense it in the air, the subtle tightening of conversations, the lingering glances exchanged by neighbors at the post office, the slightly sharper tone in Mrs. Hartnell's voice as she lectured Mr. Fotheringay about proper hedge maintenance. Beneath the village's calm exterior, curiosity lived like a cat prowling through the undergrowth. Unseen, but unmistakably present. And Miss Marple, having lived in the village for decades, recognized the early ripples of a secret beginning to spread. She stood at her garden gate, trimming a rebellious branch of her rosebush, when Mrs. Weatherby bustled up the lane carrying a market basket nearly overflowing with vegetables. "Morning, Miss Marple," she called brightly, though her tone carried the unmistakable note of someone hoping to linger for a chat. Miss Marple knew the type well. Gossip approached her naturally, like iron filings to a magnet. "Good morning, Mrs. Weatherby. A lovely day for the market, I see." "Oh yes, though Mr. Wheeler nearly overcharged me for carrots again. I do think he believes I have more coins in my purse than I actually do." Mrs. Weatherby paused, pretended to adjust her basket, then leaned ever so slightly closer. Terrible business, all that running about the other day. People are still talking, you know. That girl who dashed past, no one seems to know her name. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. People do overreact to the slightest commotion. Well, perhaps, but I heard— Mrs. Weatherby lowered her voice dramatically— that she was seen near the manor house earlier that morning. One of the maids, someone said. And you know how staff come and go there these days. How interesting, Miss Marple murmured, her tone perfectly mild. Inside, however, her thoughts sharpened. Agnes Powell had indeed worked there. Did someone say which maid? Oh, they never seem to know the details, Jane. People talk in half-finished sentences and expect me to understand the rest. Mrs. Weatherby sighed dramatically. Still, poor girl, running like that, looked frightened, someone said. Imagine, in St. Mary Mead. Quite unsettling, Miss Marple agreed gently. Mrs. Weatherby took this as encouragement. Well, if you ask me, there's something odd about the manor house lately. Ever since that new steward arrived, Mr. Waring, is it? They say he keeps ledgers locked away and he's forever pacing the halls. Very strict, too. Lucy Parker's mother told me he makes the staff feel like they're being watched. Miss Marple simply smiled. Authority figures often make young people nervous. Yes, but this seems different. Mrs. Weatherby paused, eyes narrowing a little. And Agnes Powell didn't show up for work yesterday morning. Lucy told her mother. Isn't that strange? Miss Marple felt a small chill, though she hid it with grace. So Agnes had indeed not returned home. Yet instead of panicking, she gave Mrs. Weatherby a kindly look. Let's hope she is simply visiting family or feeling unwell. Well, let's hope, Mrs. Weatherby agreed, though she clearly hoped for nothing of the sort. But if you hear anything, do let me know. Not that I pry, of course. Of course not, Miss Marple replied with a soft smile. Mrs. Weatherby hurried off down the lane, comforted by the belief that she had contributed valuable information, though much of it was hearsay. Miss Marple returned to her roses, but her mind was no longer on the flowers. She was thinking of Agnes, and of Mr. Waring, and of the letter's warning. She finished her trimming, washed her hands, and prepared to call upon an old friend who often knew more about village rumblings than anyone, Miss Florence Pierce, the school teacher. Miss Pierce's modest cottage stood near the vicarage, shaded by tall trees that made the air a little cooler. When Miss Marple knocked, Miss Pierce opened the door with her usual frazzled politeness. Oh, Miss Marple, do come in. Forgive the mess. Children's papers are everywhere. Miss Marple stepped inside, politely ignoring the modest disorder. I've only come for a short visit, Florence. I wondered if you'd heard anything about Agnes Powell. Miss Pierce blinked rapidly, her usual reaction to anything unexpected. Agnes? Why, yes, Lucy told me yesterday that she hadn't turned up. Such a quiet girl, but always punctual. Quite unlike her to miss work. She paused, lowering her voice. And Lucy seemed worried, terribly worried. Has anyone gone to check her rooming house? Miss Marple asked. Miss Pierce shook her head. Not that I know. Mrs. Channing at the manor house isn't fond of interference, and Lucy was too frightened of losing her position. Miss Marple thanked her for the information, chatted for a few more minutes in a way that put Miss Pierce at ease, and then excused herself. Once outside again, Miss Marple stood still for a moment, the breeze tugging lightly at her hat. Something was undeniably wrong. Agnes was missing. She had sought Miss Marple's help. And someone in the village, someone close, had frightened her enough to run through the lanes in panic. Miss Marple decided it was time to visit Agnes's lodgings herself. She walked purposefully down the lane toward the small row of cottages where Agnes rented a room from Mrs. Brighton, a stern widow known for her strict housekeeping and stricter rent expectations. Miss Marple had visited her once or twice during church charity rounds, When Miss Marple reached the cottage, she knocked on the door. It opened a moment later to reveal Mrs. Brighton, her hair tightly pinned and her expression perpetually displeased, as though she were bracing herself for disappointment at any moment. "Miss Marple," she said stiffly, "what brings you here?" "I'm sorry to trouble you," Miss Marple said gently. "I wondered if Agnes Powell is in. I heard she may have been unwell." Mrs. Brighton's expression tightened. "No, she's not here. Didn't come home yesterday morning. Never sent word either. Very inconsiderate." But a flicker of concern passed through her eyes, quick, but visible. "She took nothing with her. Her trunk is still upstairs." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "I see. That must be worrying for you." Mrs. Brighton sniffed. "Well, girls these days, no sense of responsibility. Still, I suppose—" She hesitated. "It's not like her." Miss Marple gave her a deeply sympathetic look. "May I say, Mrs. Brighton, if Agnes does return, I should be grateful if you would let me know. I worry she may be in some distress." Mrs. Brighton nodded stiffly, but her eyes softened. "I will." As Miss Marple walked away from the cottage, she reflected quietly. Agnes had not returned home. She had not shown up for work. And she had left all her things behind. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, one that troubled her deeply. The village might chatter and speculate, but Miss Marple sensed something far more serious beneath the surface. Agnes Powell had disappeared, not voluntarily and not safely. And Miss Marple, with the envelope still tucked safely in her handbag, knew she was now the keeper of a secret someone desperately wanted buried. Chapter 4. A letter that shouldn't exist. Morning sunlight filtered gently through the curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, touching the lace edges with a faint golden glow. The village of St. Mary Mead was beginning its quiet stirrings, milk bottles clinking on doorsteps, the faint hum of a bicycle on the lane, and the distant whistle of the postman making his rounds. Miss Marple sat by her small escritoire, spectacles perched on her nose, studying the mysterious letter that had been slipped into her knitting basket only days before. The elegant yet hurried handwriting fascinated her. Nothing in St. Mary Mead ever appeared without purpose. A letter like this, delivered in secrecy, devoid of signature, warning of a name crossed so violently it nearly tore the page, was a type of curiosity she refused to dismiss. The knock at her door interrupted her concentration. It was not the hesitant rap of a stranger, nor the brisk authority of the vicar. It was a polite, composed knock, one she recognized instantly. She rose slowly, smoothing her dress, and opened the door to find Mrs. Penelope Hawthorne, her expression slightly more rigid than usual. Mrs. Hawthorne, the well-pressed widow with excellent manners and a tendency to organize charity drives, was not generally a woman who visited early in the day. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, clutching her handbag with both hands, "forgive the intrusion, but I wondered whether I might have a brief word. Something rather delicate." "Of course," Miss Marple replied warmly. "Do come in. I've just made a fresh pot of tea." Mrs. Hawthorne sat gracefully but with an unmistakable tension in her posture. As Miss Marple poured tea, she observed the smallest tremor in the woman's gloved hands. People often revealed more in the quiet moments than in their spoken explanations. "I suppose," Mrs. Hawthorne began with a tremulous breath, "that you've heard about Mr. Clemens' disappearance." Miss Marple lifted her brows lightly. "Disappearance, my dear? I was under the impression he was simply visiting a cousin." "That's the story being told," Mrs. Hawthorne replied in a whisper. "But between you and me, the entire matter is rather suspicious. He left without forwarding his post, without informing his gardener, and without settling his monthly accounts. Quite unlike him." Miss Marple listened carefully, filing each detail with quiet precision. Mr. Alfred Clemens was a rather reclusive scholar, reported to be absent-minded but never irresponsible. A sudden departure, particularly without explanation, struck her as unusual indeed. "There is something else," Mrs. Hawthorne continued, lowering her voice further. "Mr. Clemens received a letter the day before he vanished. I saw it myself. The envelope bore no return address. He looked quite distressed after reading it." Miss Marple considered the statement with growing interest. "Did he indicate what the letter contained?" "No. But I passed him later that evening walking near the old stone well by the west gate. He seemed terribly agitated. And then," her voice faltered, "he simply left." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. The strange letter in her possession now seemed undeniably linked. But why had the mysterious informant chosen her? What was she supposed to uncover? Mrs. Hawthorne, noticing Miss Marple's silence, leaned in slightly. "I don't mean to fuel gossip, but one cannot help noticing certain people behaving rather oddly of late." "Such as?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated. "Well, Miss Lydia Greenfield, for one. She's been avoiding the high street altogether. And Mr. Pratt at the grocer's says she's taken to sending servants instead of going herself. Quite unlike her usual routines." Miss Marple made a thoughtful hum. "People often act differently when troubled." "Yes, but Lydia never hides. She thrives on being seen. To suddenly shrink from society." Mrs. Hawthorne let the implication hang. Before Miss Marple could respond, there came another knock at the door, firmer this time and distinctly hurried. To Miss Marple's surprise, Inspector Harold Fletcher stood outside, looking somewhat flushed and very serious. "Forgive me, Miss Marple," he said briskly, "but I believe we need to speak, privately." Mrs. Hawthorne stiffened. "Inspector Fletcher? Oh dear, is this about Mr. Clemens?" Fletcher gave a curt nod. "Partly, though to avoid unnecessary concern, I'd appreciate it if this discussion remained between us for now." Miss Marple invited him in, offering him tea as well, which he declined with a distracted wave. He held his hat in his hands, twisting it without realizing. "Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice, "we found something near Mr. Clemens' cottage this morning, something troubling." Miss Marple waited patiently, her expression calm. "A torn piece of paper," Fletcher continued. "Looks to be part of a letter. But the handwriting—" He paused and studied her face. "I believe it matches the sample you once helped us identify in that business with the forged receipts." "Mrs. Ellison's unfortunate account book," Miss Marple mused. "Yes, I remember. It suggests that whoever wrote that forged note might be involved here as well." Mrs. Hawthorne gasped softly. "Oh, heavens!" Inspector Fletcher leaned closer to Miss Marple. "Have you seen anything unusual recently? Anything at all?" Miss Marple considered carefully. She was not yet ready to reveal the mysterious letter. It was not secrecy for secrecy's sake. Rather, she needed more context before involving the inspector. If the letter's sender had trusted her with it, then she felt obligated to understand its purpose fully. "I have noticed certain tensions in the village," she said diplomatically. "People uneasy, behaving differently, a sense of watchfulness." Fletcher grunted. "That's one way of putting it. Something's afoot, mark my words." Mrs. Hawthorne placed a hand on her chest. "Inspector, surely Mr. Clemens hasn't been harmed." "We don't know," Fletcher replied, "but I intend to find out." A sudden rustling came from outside, someone moving hurriedly along the path, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Fletcher turned sharply, but saw only the shadow of a figure disappearing behind the hedge. Miss Marple noted the swiftness, the slope of the shoulders, the way the person moved as if afraid of being seen. Someone had been listening. As Fletcher excused himself to pursue the unknown eavesdropper, Mrs. Hawthorne stood, clearly rattled. "Miss Marple, something is wrong in St. Mary Mead. I can feel it. Please do be careful." When she finally left, the house fell still. Miss Marple returned to her escritoire and lifted the letter again. She studied the crossed-out name, the hurried script, the faint smudge of ink near the margin. Her mind moved through possibilities with steady precision. A vanished man, a secret letter, a crossed-out name, a frightened informant. And now, a torn fragment found near the missing man's home. The threads were beginning to weave together, but the pattern was not yet clear. She folded the letter neatly and placed it back into its envelope. There was only one sensible next step. She must visit Mr. Clemens' cottage herself. Chapter 5. Footsteps on the cobbled lane. The afternoon air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp stillness that made every sound seem sharper than usual. The flap of a sparrow's wings, the turning of a bicycle wheel, the faint clatter of a teacup behind an open window. Miss Marple walked along the cobbled lane toward Mr. Alfred Clemens' cottage, her steps steady, her hands clasped politely behind her back. She appeared, to any casual observer, like a sweet elderly lady taking her usual constitutional. But beneath that unassuming exterior, her mind worked with the quiet precision of a well-organized filing cabinet, placing every detail in its appropriate drawer. The Clemens cottage sat at the far edge of the village, nestled behind a weathered stone wall overgrown with ivy. The gate creaked gently as Miss Marple opened it, as though protesting the intrusion. She paused before stepping inside, her eyes scanning the ground with subtle care. The earth was soft from last evening's drizzle, and faint footprints, half smudged, half clear, led not only up to the door but also around the side of the cottage. Interestingly, the prints varied in size. One set was distinctively larger and heavier, perhaps belonging to a man. Another appeared smaller, lighter, possibly a woman's shoe. Miss Marple noted the shapes, the angles, the peculiar outward tilt of one heel. Clues often lay in such ordinary observations. She knocked lightly on the door, though she fully expected no answer. After a polite moment, she tried the handle. It was locked, perfectly sensible but inconvenient. Miss Marple was about to turn away when she noticed that the side window just near the garden patch was slightly ajar. Not enough for anyone to have climbed through recently, she judged, but enough to let in the cold night air. It seemed careless for Mr. Clemens, who was known to be quite meticulous. The garden itself was in disarray. While Clemens was fond of plants, he tended them with a scholar's methodical neatness. Yet now, tools lay scattered, a clay pot lay smashed by the hedge, and the soil near the rose bush was freshly disturbed. Leaning in, Miss Marple detected a faint indentation in the earth, shallow but deliberate, as though something had been hurriedly buried. Unfortunately, she had neither a trowel nor the inclination to dig openly in someone else's garden at that moment, so she added the detail to her mental ledger. As she walked around toward the back of the house, she heard a faint noise, quick, light, and furtive. Someone was nearby. The sound vanished almost instantly, and Miss Marple did not chase it. Instead, she simply listened. The quiet after the sound was even more telling. Whoever had been watching did not wish to be seen. Returning to the front, Miss Marple stepped back onto the lane, her attention drawn to a small folded scrap of paper lodged beneath the gate's bottom hinge. She bent slowly, more slowly than necessary in case someone watched, and retrieved it. The paper was damp and crinkled as though handled in haste. On it, a single sentence had been scrawled, "He knew too much." There was no signature. The message might have been melodramatic in another village, but St. Mary Mead had a peculiar way of making even the strangest occurrences feel entirely possible. Miss Marple slipped the note into her handbag, careful not to crease it further. Her mind returned to the letter the mysterious informant had given her. the crossed-out name, the unfinished warning. Now another message. Another fragment, another puzzle piece. But whose handwriting was this? Not the same as the earlier letter. This one was hurried, almost panicked. She began her walk back toward the high street, the cobbles clicking softly beneath her sensible shoes. As she passed the vicarage, she spotted Lydia Greenfield emerging from the side gate. The young woman moved quickly, her head lowered, her gloved hands clutching a folder to her chest. Miss Marple raised a hand in greeting, and Lydia hesitated before offering a thin, forced smile. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice breathless, though she had taken only a few steps. "Lovely day, isn't it?" "Quite pleasant," Miss Marple agreed. "Out for errands?" Lydia nodded too quickly. "Yes, just errands. Nothing of importance." Miss Marple's eyes fell to the folder Lydia held so tightly. Papers peeked out from the sides, edges uneven. Lydia noticed the glance and shifted the folder behind her back, her smile tightening. "You've not heard anything?" "Odd, have you?" Lydia asked suddenly. "About Mr. Clemens? People are talking, and I simply detest gossip." Miss Marple gave her a kind look. "I've only heard he left town rather abruptly." Lydia swallowed, her throat bobbing visibly. "Yes, very abrupt, very unexpected." "And have you seen him recently?" Miss Marple asked casually, as though asking after the weather. Lydia shook her head too quickly again. "No, not at all. Why would I?" She stepped back, adjusting the folder once more. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I really must be going." She walked off swiftly, her steps uneven, as though she was torn between wanting to flee and wanting not to draw attention. Miss Marple watched her until she turned the corner, noting every nervous twitch, every backward glance. Something was troubling Lydia deeply. Continuing down the lane, Miss Marple stopped at the crossroads by the old stone well, the same place Mrs. Hawthorne had mentioned seeing Mr. Clemens on the night he disappeared. She stepped closer, examining the moss-covered stones. They were damp, but not recently. Disturbed. Yet something glinted faintly at the base. Kneeling with the help of the well's rim, she retrieved a small metallic button, dark, heavy, and embossed with a crest. Not the sort worn by villagers, more like part of a uniform. She tucked it away, adding this new clue to her ever-growing list. As she resumed her walk, she felt a prickle along the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She did not turn. Instead, she paused to adjust her scarf, using the movement to glance discreetly at a window above the abandoned mill. A curtain fell back into place the moment she looked. Someone in St. Mary Mead was paying very close attention to her movements. Miss Marple reached her gate just as the church bell chimed the hour. She entered her cottage calmly, though her mind hummed with quiet intensity. She placed the newly found button on her table beside the anonymous note. 2 clues, small yet significant. She reached for the original letter, the one slipped secretly into her knitting basket. There were now 3 pieces, 3 signals pointing toward one unsettling truth. Mr. Clemens had not simply left. Something had driven him into danger, or worse. Miss Marple sat in her armchair, folded her hands neatly, and let her thoughts settle into place. The pattern was forming slowly, faintly, but undeniably. And she suspected that before long the reluctant informant, whoever they were, would reveal themselves once more. The village was stirring with secrets, and Miss Marple intended to uncover every one of them. Chapter 6. Shadows in the Vicarage Hall. A soft mist drifted over St. Mary Mead the following morning, cloaking the village in a pale, dreamy veil that blurred the edges of familiar cottages and hedges. Miss Marple, having risen early, felt a certain urgency in the air, an instinctive sense that the next clues would not present themselves unless she stepped forward to meet them. And so, with her sensible coat and neatly folded gloves, she made her way to the vicarage, where Reverend Leonard Harper and his brisk, efficient wife resided. The vicarage hall was unusually quiet when she arrived. The front door stood slightly ajar, as though someone had entered in haste and forgotten to close it properly. Miss Marple knocked gently before pushing it open a bit farther. The hall was dimly lit, the morning light unable to penetrate the heavy curtains. The vicar's study door was ajar, and soft voices carried into the hall. Low, tense, hurried. She stepped inside just far enough to announce herself without startling anyone. "Reverend Harper? Mrs. Harper, it's Miss Marple." The voices fell silent. A moment later, Mrs. Harper emerged, smoothing her apron and trying unsuccessfully to disguise her startled expression. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said with forced cheer. "What a surprise. We didn't expect visitors quite this early." "Forgive me, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "But I felt compelled to ask after you both. The village seems rather unsettled these days." Mrs. Harper's hands fidgeted with her apron strings. "Oh, there's always gossip or fuss of some kind. I pay it no mind." But Miss Marple saw the strain around her eyes and the unusual disarray in the normally immaculate hall. Something was quite certainly amiss. "May I see the Reverend for just a moment?" Miss Marple asked kindly. Mrs. Harper hesitated, then nodded with a sigh. "Very well. He's in his study." Miss Marple stepped inside the study and found Reverend Harper at his desk, his brow furrowed, a stack of opened envelopes scattered before him. In his hands he held a single sheet of paper, which he swiftly folded and tucked under a ledger when he noticed her. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, though his voice lacked its usual warmth. "Good heavens, is something the matter?" "I might ask the same of you," she replied, her gaze lingering briefly on the hidden paper. "You look rather troubled." The Reverend attempted a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Parish matters. Tedious. Nothing more." Miss Marple took a seat, waiting in the kind of silence that gently encouraged confession. The Reverend rubbed his forehead. "I suppose in truth there is something weighing on my mind. Confidentially, of course." "Of course," she echoed. The Reverend glanced toward the door, then spoke in a low voice. "It's about Mr. Clemens. He came to see me the night before he disappeared." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Did he now? That is most interesting." "He appeared deeply distressed," the vicar continued. "Pale as linen and trembling. He asked to use my typewriter. Said he needed to write something without returning to his cottage. I didn't ask why, though perhaps I should have. He typed for nearly an hour, sealed the pages in an envelope, and left abruptly. I never saw him again." "A letter?" Miss Marple asked. "Do you know to whom it was addressed?" The Reverend shook his head. "No name on the envelope, only the words, 'To be given only if I do not return.' He asked me to keep it in my desk drawer." Miss Marple's eyes widened just slightly. "And may I ask where that envelope is now?" "Gone," he replied, his voice heavy. "Taken from my drawer sometime during the night. I discovered it missing only this morning." Miss Marple's fingers tightened over her handbag. "That is exceedingly troubling, Reverend." He nodded helplessly. "Indeed. I fear someone else in the village knows far more about Mr. Clemens' disappearance than they are willing to admit." Miss Marple thought of Lydia Greenfield's trembling hands, of Mrs. Hawthorne's worried whispers, of the mysterious figure watching from the mill window, and of the torn fragments of letters scattered like breadcrumbs across the village. Someone was moving quickly, desperately, to hide something. She rose from her chair. "Thank you, Reverend. I believe your information may prove invaluable." As she stepped into the hall again, she noticed a coat lying across a chair. Not the Reverend's, not Mrs. Harper's. A visitor's coat, perhaps. She leaned closer, The buttons on the coat were embossed with a crest, identical to the single metallic button she had found near the well. A thrill of recognition passed through her. This was no coincidence. Before she could inspect it further, the vicarage door swung open sharply and Mr. Edward Finch, the village solicitor, strode into the hall. He halted abruptly upon seeing Miss Marple standing near his coat. His expression flickered. Surprise, irritation, then something colder. "Miss Marple," he said tightly, "what brings you here?" "Oh, merely calling upon the Harpers," she replied with pleasant innocence. "And yourself?" "A parish matter," he said quickly. "Confidential." Mrs. Harper appeared again, flustered, smoothing her apron nervously. "Mr. Finch left a few papers last night. He's come to collect them." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes drifted toward the Reverend's study door. Papers, indeed. Perhaps the very envelope that had gone missing. Mr. Finch collected his coat, brushing the spot where the missing button should have been. "Good day," he muttered before leaving with an air of haste. Miss Marple watched him go, her suspicions growing heavier. Once outside the vicarage, she walked slowly toward the crossroads, reflecting quietly. Mr. Finch had always been a composed, respectable man, reliable, but respectability was not always synonymous with honesty. And his coat, with its missing button, placed him very near the old stone well on the night Mr. Clemens vanished. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. Men in positions of authority often brushed against secrets out of duty rather than guilt. Still, his rapid appearance, his defensiveness, and the late-night visit to the vicarage were all troubling threads. As she reached the lane, the mist began to lift. The day was brightening slowly, revealing the outlines of cottages and hedges once more. But the shadows in the vicarage hall remained vivid in her mind. And one thing was certain. The missing letter, the missing man, and the missing button were all connected. Miss Marple tightened her shawl around her shoulders. Someone in St. Mary Mead was hiding the truth, and the truth, she felt certain, was drawing ever nearer. Chapter 7. The informant speaks at last. The late afternoon light filtered softly through the clouds as Miss Marple returned home, the rhythm of her steps calm but her mind alive with quiet urgency. She had scarcely settled into her armchair when she heard the faintest of taps at her door. So light it was almost a whisper rather than a knock. It was the sort of knock given by someone who wished very much not to be heard. Miss Marple rose at once. When she opened the door, she found Lydia Greenfield standing on her threshold, pale and trembling, her gloves clutched tightly in her hands. Her eyes darted nervously over her shoulder before settling on Miss Marple with a mixture of desperation and shame. "Miss Marple," Lydia's voice cracked softly. "May I come in? Please, just for a moment." "Of course, my dear." Miss Marple stepped aside with gentle warmth. "Do come inside. You look quite shaken." Lydia entered quickly, almost stumbling, and Miss Marple guided her to the sofa. The young woman sat rigidly, her breath rapid, her eyes wide with terror she was trying, and failing, to conceal. "I can't keep quiet anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought I could handle it on my own, but it's become too much. I'm frightened, Miss Marple, truly frightened." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly, offering Lydia the stillness she so desperately lacked. "Just take your time, my dear. What is troubling you?" Lydia swallowed hard, her fingers twisting her gloves until the seams strained. "It's about Mr. Clemens, about the night he disappeared. I saw him before he left. I haven't told anyone, not even the inspector." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle but attentive. "Go on, child." "I went to his cottage that evening," Lydia continued shakily, "not for any improper reason. I had to return something to him, a document he had lent me for research, a very old genealogical record connected to the village archives. "And how did he seem when you arrived?" Miss Marple asked. "Terrified," Lydia breathed. "He kept looking out the windows, locking and unlocking the doors. He said someone was watching him, that someone had discovered the truth he'd uncovered in the archives. And then he showed me a letter he'd received earlier that day." Miss Marple's pulse quickened ever so slightly. "A letter? What did it say?" Lydia shook her head. "He wouldn't let me read the whole thing, but it warned him to stop digging into old village matters. Something about buried secrets in a name, crossed out violently as if the writer regretted including it." Miss Marple thought instantly of the letter hidden in her knitting basket, the name scratched out so fiercely it nearly tore the paper. Then Lydia's voice dropped to an even fainter whisper. "He told me he'd written a longer statement, an explanation of everything he'd discovered to leave with someone he trusted. And then he said he feared he would not live long enough to deliver it." Miss Marple felt a chill, not from fear but from the quiet weight of truth settling into place. "And what happened next?" Lydia closed her eyes briefly. "He heard something outside. A footstep, he said, a rustle along the hedge. He panicked. He stuffed the papers into a folder and told me to leave at once through the back garden. I wanted to stay. I wanted to help him, but he pushed me out. When I looked back, he was burning another stack of papers in the fireplace." "And that was the last time you saw him?" Lydia nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I walked to the lane and turned back once, just once. And I saw a man stepping through his gate. I couldn't see his face, only the coat he wore, and the crest on the buttons." Miss Marple's breath stilled ever so slightly. The crest, the button she found by the well, the coat she saw at the vicarage. "Was it perhaps Mr. Finch's coat?" Miss Marple asked softly. Lydia's lips trembled. "Yes, I believe it was." The room grew quiet. A few logs crackled in the fireplace, but did little to warm the tension that settled between them. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand over Lydia's. "My dear, you've carried far too much fear on your own. You did the right thing by coming here." Lydia let out a shaky sob. "I didn't want to accuse anyone wrongly. And Mr. Finch, he's respected, important. Who would believe me?" She lowered her voice to a whisper. "But I think he knows I saw him. He's been watching me, Miss Marple, following me at odd hours, and last night, someone rifled through my desk. The document Mr. Clemens lent me is missing." Miss Marple felt the pieces align like a subtle but unmistakable pattern on a tapestry. The missing papers, the stolen envelope from the vicarage, the button, the late-night visits, Lydia's fear. "It seems," Miss Marple said gently, "that you, my dear, are the reluctant informant." Lydia stared at her with wide eyes. "I never wanted to be involved. I only wanted to help Mr. Clemens, and now I fear I may be next." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said firmly, though not unkindly. "You are safe here with me. And this situation, though tangled, is not beyond understanding." For a few moments Lydia cried quietly, the release of fear long held. Miss Marple sat patiently, offering a handkerchief and the quiet comfort only she could give. When Lydia finally collected herself, Miss Marple rose with calm purpose. "There is one more thing you must tell me. The document Mr. Clemens lent you, the genealogical record. What precisely did it reveal?" Lydia hesitated. "It suggested that part of the village land now owned by a certain respected family, was not lawfully obtained. Decades ago there was a transfer, forged perhaps. If exposed, it would bring scandal, ruin. And Mr. Clemens discovered evidence of this improper transfer?" "Yes," Lydia whispered. "He believed someone in the village would do anything to keep it hidden." Miss Marple felt her resolve strengthen. Secrets buried in land deeds had toppled more than one reputation in her lifetime, and a person defending their prestige, especially a solicitor in charge of legal papers, might go to desperate lengths. When Lydia finally left, slipping into the dusk like a frightened bird, Miss Marple remained standing by her window, watching the shadows lengthen across the lane. The reluctant informant had spoken. The truth was beginning to take shape. But the danger, Miss Marple knew, was only just beginning. Chapter 8. Secrets Among the Hedgerows. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was unusually crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and early autumn leaves. Miss Marple walked slowly along the narrow lane that led past the vicarage toward the outskirts of the village, her eyes alert for the smallest disturbances, the kind that often whispered truths louder than words. Ever since Lydia Greenfield had confided the harrowing tale of Mr. Clemen's last hours, Miss Marple had been piecing together the intricate web of fear, deceit, and hidden intentions that now enveloped the village. She stopped briefly at the old stone well by the crossroads, where she had discovered the metallic button weeks before. The ground around it had been trampled recently, though the prints were not fresh. Miss Marple crouched to inspect them closely, noting the mixture of large and small prints again. Whoever had been here was careful but not meticulous, leaving traces behind with every step. She straightened, brushing damp leaves from her coat, her mind turning over the implications. It was here, at this quiet, overlooked corner of the village, that she noticed something she had not before: a faint line in the soil, a subtle indentation that suggested a small object had been dragged. Her sharp eyes caught the tiniest hint of disturbance near the hedgerow. Kneeling carefully, she reached into the undergrowth and extracted a folded scrap of paper, yellowed at the edges, partially torn. She opened it with reverent patience. A hurried note, scrawled in dark ink, contained only a single sentence. "Meet me by the orchard, midnight, alone." Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting threads. Who had written this? Who intended to meet in the orchard? And most importantly, why at midnight, under the cloak of darkness? Every detail of St. Mary Mead whispered a story if one was willing to listen. Her next steps were clear. She must inspect the orchard, and she would do so not in the blind hope of confrontation, but in quiet observation, as any detective worth her salt would. The orchard lay behind the largest of the village's estates, the property of Mr. Edward Finch, the solicitor who had cast the longest shadow over the recent events. His estate was bordered by dense hedgerows, the trees heavy with ripening apples, their fruits dropping silently onto the earth. Miss Marple approached cautiously, noting the patterns in the grass, the careful arrangement of stones that suggested paths seldom used but deliberately maintained. From the hedge line, she could observe the faint glow of the windows inside the house. A figure moved past, deliberately avoiding the front path, their footsteps muffled by the damp grass. Miss Marple crouched lower, adjusting her hat to shield her view from any prying eyes, and studied the figure's posture, the way they held their arms, the careful glances over their shoulder. There was tension, urgency, but also the unmistakable deliberation of someone who knew precisely what they were doing. Miss Marple's observations were interrupted by the soft rustle of the hedgerow beside her. She turned slightly, peering into the shadowed undergrowth, and glimpsed Lydia Greenfield once more. The young woman froze when she saw Miss Marple, her eyes wide with fear, then relaxed slightly when she recognized the familiar, reassuring figure. "Miss Marple," Lydia whispered. I thought I might find him here, the one who sent the note. But it's too dangerous. I can't go any further." "I understand, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, placing a comforting hand on Lydia's arm. "But your presence alone helps me. Tell me everything you know." Lydia glanced nervously toward the house. "The orchard. It's always been private. Only Mr. Finch and the family gardener go there. And the note, It mentioned someone who could only be trusted if alone, someone who wanted to speak to Mr. Clemens in secret. Miss Marple considered this, her keen mind turning over every detail. Mr. Clemens' discoveries, the forged land documents, the sudden disappearance, Lydia's account. Everything suggested a deliberate attempt to suppress information, to intimidate or perhaps even harm. Whoever orchestrated this had resources, knowledge of the village's patterns, and a willingness to manipulate others to achieve their ends. The two women waited quietly, hidden among the hedgerows, observing the slow movement of servants and household staff as they carried out ordinary morning duties. Yet within the ordinary lay subtle anomalies. A gardener paused longer than necessary, glancing furtively over his shoulder. A servant adjusted a hedge, but in doing so obscured part of a path that seemed frequently used at odd hours. Miss Marple noted each detail with clinical precision. In St. Mary Mead, secrets were often hidden in the smallest gestures. "I believe," Miss Marple whispered, "that someone is orchestrating a pattern. Each step, each note, each disappearance is deliberate. They are attempting to control knowledge, to prevent truths from surfacing." Lydia shivered. "Do you think Mr. Clemens, he may be in danger?" "Possibly," Miss Marple admitted, though her voice remained calm and measured. "But we are not without options. Observing is the first step. Understanding comes next. And once we know, we can act." The morning waned, the mist lifting from the village and revealing the familiar cottages, lanes, and gardens of St. Mary Mead. But within this tranquil scene, Miss Marple's mind was already mapping out strategies, recalling every conversation, every secret glance, every fragment of torn paper she had collected over the past days. By the time she returned to her own garden gate, the village seemed unchanged to any casual observer. Birds chirped in the hedges, smoke curled from chimneys, children laughed in the distance. Yet Miss Marple knew the quiet had a dual nature. Beneath the calm exterior lay fear, secrets, and cunning. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the orchestrator of these events was watching, waiting, perhaps unaware that their patterns were being noticed, analyzed, and understood. Miss Marple sat in her armchair that evening, the orchard and its secrets heavy in her thoughts. Lydia had given her more than mere information. She had provided insight into human fear and the lengths people would go to protect or conceal the truth. And Miss Marple, with decades of careful observation and experience, knew that the next move must be hers. The village might seem peaceful, but St. Mary Mead had always held undercurrents beneath its surface, and those undercurrents were beginning to swirl faster now, gathering momentum. Miss Marple folded her hands and looked at the collection of papers, notes, and buttons laid carefully before her. Each was a clue, each a testament to someone's actions, intentions, and secrets. She knew the pieces were coming together like the final strokes of a painting that, once complete, would reveal not only the culprit but the intricate web of motives, fears, and hidden truths that had brought the village to this tense brink. And in the orchard behind the hedgerows, Miss Marple sensed the quiet stirring of truth waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 9. The Confrontation in the Orchard. The orchard lay in silence under a silvery evening sky, the branches heavy with the last of autumn's apples, the ground soft and damp from a light drizzle that had passed earlier. Miss Marple moved carefully along the hidden path she had memorized, her eyes sweeping every inch of hedgerow and shadow. She had arrived long before anyone else, knowing that patience would be her greatest ally. The village of St. Mary Mead slept quietly around her, unaware that the truth of Mr. Clemens's disappearance would soon be laid bare among these very trees. From her concealed vantage point, she observed the faint glow of a lantern in the distance. It bobbed gently along the path, held by a tall, deliberate figure. Miss Marple recognized the posture immediately. It was Mr. Edward Finch, the village solicitor, careful, precise, yet tense, as though every step weighed heavily upon him. He paused occasionally, glancing over his shoulder, then continued on toward the center of the orchard. Miss Marple's sharp eyes picked out another figure approaching from the opposite direction. Lydia Greenfield, clutching a small folder to her chest, her steps hurried but hesitant. She had agreed to return to the orchard, though trembling with fear under the assurance that Miss Marple would be nearby. The two converging paths, the orchard and the lantern, created a tableau charged with expectation, suspense, and the imminence of revelation. Finch stopped near a small stone bench, his shoulders stiff. He looked around, muttering under his breath as if rehearsing words or perhaps arguments for a confrontation he expected but did not fully control. Lydia stepped onto the soft grass, trembling, and stopped at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed on Finch. Neither spoke immediately. Both were caught in the electric tension of anticipation. Miss Marple, unseen, allowed herself to study the solicitor. Every movement, every glance spoke volumes. Finch's hands tightened around the lantern. His steps were measured but betraying impatience. His gaze swept the orchard repeatedly, a pattern betraying both anxiety and awareness of unseen witnesses. At last, Lydia's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Finch, I have the document Mr. Clemens lent me. I only meant to return it safely. You don't have to... Finch cut her off sharply, the words nearly hissing. "You should have left well enough alone, Lydia. You have no idea what you're meddling with, no idea." His tone betrayed frustration, fear, and a faint trace of desperation. From the shadows, Miss Marple stepped forward quietly, revealing herself. Both Lydia and Finch froze. The lantern light illuminated her calm, resolute expression. "Mr. Finch," she said softly but firmly, "I believe you know exactly what Lydia has discovered, and I also believe you know what Mr. Clemens uncovered before his disappearance." Finch's face paled, and he took a small step backward. "Miss Marple, this is preposterous." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Preposterous, perhaps. But consider the facts. The torn letters, the threats, the missing papers, the metallic button by the well, the nocturnal activity in the vicarage, and now, the orchard itself." She paused, letting each word settle. "All evidence points towards someone with the means, knowledge, and motive to manipulate others and conceal truths. Someone who felt compelled to silence Mr. Clemens before his findings became known." Lydia clutched her folder tightly. "Yes. He was trying to protect the estate, the papers, and the family name. He said it would ruin everything if anyone knew the truth." Finch's hands shook slightly as he lowered the lantern, the weight of Miss Marple's quiet but penetrating observation pressing upon him. "You don't understand," he muttered, almost to himself. "Clemens. He threatened the land, the documents. All of it would have undone years of careful management, decades of respectability. Yet," Miss Marple said softly, "you chose fear over discussion, threats over explanation. Mr. Clemens disappeared, and the papers that could have clarified matters were stolen or destroyed. You left Lydia frightened, the village confused, and the truth buried in shadows." For a long moment, Finch said nothing. His jaw tightened. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded bundle of papers. The very documents that had been missing from both the vicarage and Lydia's folder. "It was meant to be safeguarded," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I intended to keep it secure until proper counsel could intervene. I never meant harm. Only control. Only secrecy." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice calm, precise. "Control through secrecy, Mr. Finch, is often indistinguishable from wrongdoing. Mr. Clemens discovered forged land transfers, improper acquisitions. You feared scandal, but in trying to prevent it, you created a far greater disturbance. A missing man, frightened witnesses, and a village in turmoil. Finch lowered the papers, defeated. The lantern light flickered across his troubled face. Lydia stepped forward slightly, relief mingling with lingering fear. "Then, he's alive?" she whispered. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, my dear. Mr. Clemens is unharmed, though he has chosen discretion until he feels safe. The disappearance was a precaution, not a calamity. And now, thanks to your courage in speaking, Lydia, the path to clarity is open." Finch exhaled heavily, the weight of his own conscience finally pressing him into submission. "I only wanted to protect the village's reputation and the family's legacy. I misjudged. I see that now." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Recognition is the first step toward rectification. There will be consequences, Mr. Finch, but the truth is no longer hidden in shadows. That is what matters most." The orchard lay quiet once more, the tension dissolving in the soft evening light. Birds stirred in the trees, and the distant bells of St. Mary Mead chimed gently as though celebrating the return of reason and understanding. Miss Marple gathered the scattered papers, making a mental note to deliver them safely to Mr. Clemens at first light. Lydia, now visibly relieved, clutched her folder with a lighter grip, as though the burden of secrecy had been lifted. Miss Marple glanced once more at Finch. "Take care in the days to come. Actions born of fear can cast long shadows. But now, honesty must prevail." Finch nodded, a quiet surrender in his eyes. Lydia gave Miss Marple a small, grateful smile before heading back along the path toward the village, the evening air lifting the tension in her steps. Miss Marple remained in the orchard for a moment longer, breathing in the cool, fragrant air. The case, though intricate and filled with misdirection, had reached its turning point. The reluctant informant had spoken, the mystery of the orchard had been unveiled, and the village of St. Mary Mead could begin to recover from its recent unease. And Miss Marple, as always, had ensured that the truth, careful, precise, and unobtrusive, was preserved for all to see. Chapter 10. Morning tea and quiet resolution. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, casting a soft, golden light across the village's familiar cottages and winding lanes. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew-soaked grass and chimney smoke, and a sense of calm seemed to settle over the streets as if the village itself had exhaled. Miss Marple stood by her kitchen window, her hands folded neatly, gazing out at the quiet scene. The orchard, the well, and the cobbled lanes, all the places that had held tension, fear, and secrets only days before, now appeared peaceful, ordinary, and almost inviting. Her kettle whistled softly, and she poured the freshly brewed tea into delicate china cups, the steam curling in gentle spirals. The events of the past week weighed lightly in her mind now, each piece falling into place with satisfying clarity. Lydia Greenfield would arrive soon, bringing with her the documents that had caused so much unrest, and the story of courage that had led to the resolution. And of course, Mr. Alfred Clemens himself would be present, quietly overseeing the restoration of his papers and the recounting of events. Miss Marple placed a small plate of scones on the table, alongside clotted cream and strawberry preserves. She reflected that mysteries, much like baking, required patience, careful observation, and a willingness to attend to subtle details, no matter how insignificant they might appear. In this case, ordinary objects, letters, buttons, hedgerows, and footsteps, had provided the clues that led to understanding, reminding her once more that nothing in St. Mary Mead occurred without meaning. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Lydia Greenfield, her expression now composed, though her eyes still held the faintest shadow of the fear she had endured. She stepped inside, offering a polite smile that masked the relief she clearly felt. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said softly. Thank you for allowing me to come so early. Good morning, my dear, Miss Marple replied warmly, guiding her toward the table. Please sit. Tea is ready, and I dare say a scone will help steady the nerves after last night's events. Lydia's hands trembled only slightly as she accepted the cup, and she sat down with a sense of purpose that had not been present in the orchard. I've brought the documents, she said, setting the folder carefully on the table. And, well, Mr. Clemens wanted me to explain everything in full from the beginning. At that moment, a soft knock signaled another visitor. Miss Marple rose and opened the door to find Mr. Alfred Clemens standing quietly, his usual scholarly composure intact, though the faint lines of tension still marked his face. He offered a small nod of greeting. Miss Marple, he said politely, thank you for your efforts. I've been able to retrieve the papers, and I feel much safer now knowing the matter has been resolved. Do sit, Mr. Clemens, Miss Marple said. You've certainly given St. Mary Mead quite a puzzle these past days. He settled into a chair, folding his hands over the folder Lydia had brought. Indeed, he agreed. And I must admit the role of careful observation, your careful observation, has been invaluable. Without it, I would have had no assurance that the papers were safe or that Lydia's courage would not have been for naught. Lydia blushed, but Miss Marple inclined her head in quiet approval. Sometimes the smallest acts of bravery lead to the greatest resolutions, she said. And you, my dear, were the one who preserved the evidence while showing discretion. That alone speaks volumes of character. Clemens opened the folder and began to recount the story in precise, careful detail, explaining the findings from the village archives and the irregularities in land documents. Miss Marple listened attentively, noting where Lydia's earlier observations had filled in gaps and where the events in the orchard had clarified Finch's motives. Mr. Finch, it turned out, had acted out of fear of scandal rather than malice, and though his methods were misguided, the outcome could have been far worse if Miss Marple had not intervened. As the narrative unfolded, the tea was poured, scones were eaten, and the tension that had pervaded the village seemed to dissipate with every word. Miss Marple's gentle questions guided the conversation, allowing the truth to emerge without recrimination, with the calm dignity and warmth that only she could provide. After a while, Clemens leaned back, folding the papers neatly. And so, Miss Marple, the mystery is solved. The documents are safe, the irregularities accounted for, and the lessons of caution and honesty are preserved for the future. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes reflecting the satisfaction of resolution. Yes, and the village itself will return to its quiet, ordinary rhythm. Secrets may linger, but they are no longer threatening. St. Mary Mead thrives best when its people act with integrity, and now we have seen both the consequences of concealment and the value of courage. Lydia glanced at Miss Marple with gratitude. Thank you, truly. I was so frightened, but you guided me, and I learned that discretion and honesty can walk hand in hand. Clemens added, and I am grateful that St. Mary Mead's reputation has been preserved without further harm. Though I must admit the lesson of humility in the face of fear will remain with me longer than any document. Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly, her sharp mind satisfied. She reflected on the subtle threads that had led to this resolution. A button found by a well, a torn letter, furtive footsteps along hedgerows, and a reluctant but brave informant who had trusted her judgment. It was, in every sense, a classic puzzle, solved not with haste or alarm, but with patience, observation, and empathy. As the morning sun climbed higher, the village of St. Mary Mead began to stir. Birds chirped in the hedges, the church bells rang, and the distant hum of everyday life reminded all present that the ordinary, peaceful rhythm of the village had returned. Miss Marple looked at her companions, a gentle smile playing on her lips. Let us enjoy our tea, she said warmly. And remember that mysteries, while intriguing, are best approached with care, kindness, and a willingness to listen. That is the true measure of understanding. And so, over scones and clotted cream, the village of St. Mary Mead found its equilibrium once more. The papers were accounted for, the fears were laid to rest, and those who had been caught in the tangle of secrets and shadows could return to their ordinary lives with clarity, wisdom, and a sense of quiet triumph. Miss Marple looked out the window one final time, watching the village settle into its peaceful rhythm. The orchard, the well, the cobbled lanes, all held their secrets still, but now those secrets were understood. And for a moment, in the warm light of morning tea and gentle conversation, the village, and its ever-observant sleuth, felt entirely at peace. With a faint sigh of satisfaction, Miss Marple turned back to her companions, ready to continue her quiet life, content in the knowledge that even the most tangled of mysteries could be unraveled with patience, kindness, and careful observation. The village of St. Mary Mead, in all its charm and simplicity, had survived its trial, and the lessons learned would quietly shape its future, hidden in the smiles, whispers, and footsteps of its people.